Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the UNM Department of Anthropology Spring Colloquium Series. Before I introduce today's very special speaker, I want to acknowledge that the University of New Mexico is located on the traditional land of the Pueblo of Sandia. This land holds deep historical, spiritual, and personal significance for New Mexico's indigenous peoples, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache. We acknowledge their connection to this land, and we're grateful for the opportunity to live and work and learn here. I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jada Benn Torres, who is the director of the Genetic Anthropology and Biocultural Studies Laboratory at Vanderbilt University in beautiful Nashville, Tennessee. Jada received her PhD from the University of New Mexico in 2006, and we're super thrilled to have her back here today. So Jada's primary research area is the Anglophone and Hispanic Caribbean, where she explores ancient and modern population genetics and African and Indigenous Caribbean peoples. And principles of community-based participatory research heavily influence her research agenda. Jada has also published on the impacts of genetic technologies on contemporary populations with specific regard to issues of race and identity. In 2020, Jada published an extraordinary book entitled Genetic Ancestry, Our Stories, Our Past. And this year in 2021, she was the recipient of the very prestigious Robert W. Sussman Award for Scientific Contributions to Anthropology, awarded by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Jada, take it away. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really thrilled to have you here.
Okay, I'm not muted. All right, well, thank you so much, Ian, and the faculty at UNM. Many of our familiar faces from when I was there, and many new faces. But again, thank you all for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share my research. So what I want to talk to you about is some of the new work that I've begun, stopped, and started, and we'll get to that story. But it's really about connecting our ideas of biology and human variation to culture and lived experience. So what I really want to share with you today is some of my more recent research on the genetic ancestry of Afro-Puerto Rican populations. Beyond showing you what I've learned about genetic variation within the community and what it might mean for understanding more about the intersections of biology and culture, I also want to share with you some of the scholarly challenges of doing population-based work in terms of navigating the politics of identity. I want to discuss how being attentive to the ethnographic context can influence specific approaches to sampling and in turn the overall findings of the study. So to begin, I actually want to take a few words and speak about genetic ancestry. So the emergence of direct-to-consumer tests in the late 1990s, as well as the growing popularity of genetic ancestry tests offered by companies like 23andMe, Family Tree, or Ancestry.com, has been a gateway for many people to more directly interact with scientific data as a way to think about themselves and others as biological organisms with distinctive pasts. Genetic ancestry tests have received more attention in large part due to these edutainment shows. So things like Finding Your Roots or Who Do You Think You Are, or even Genealogy Roadshow. These shows, in these shows, the participants rely upon conventional genealogy as well as genetic technologies to help them learn more about their own family histories. Anthropologists have also applied these same techniques or technologies to address broader questions about human origins, migration, and variation. These sorts of studies suggest that genomic data can provide new perspectives on questions of anthropological and of historical significance. So in the context of the communities that I work with, many of whom are disenfranchised, the interest and use of genetic ancestry really aligns with the goals of these communities that I collaborate with, and that they can learn more about their histories, specifically those histories that have been denied to them. This idea of engaging with genetic data as a way to fill gaps in knowledge is embedded in my lab insignia and mission. For this, I've adopted the concept or aphorism known as Sinkofa. Sinkofa is an Ndinkra with origins among Akan-speaking peoples of present-day Ghana, and it represents this idea that there is worth in going back and having an understanding of the past, as this is crucial to making sense and understanding the present. Here, a bird looks at its tail as a reminder to go back and fetch it. That is, to look to the past to make sense of the present and the future. This 𝗍𝗫𝗄 elicits a central idea that's also reflected in that of genetic histories. Using the tools of molecular genetics and principles of population genetics, genetic histories can be constructed to query demographics, biogeographic origins, and relationships of past populations as they're reflected in patterns of genetic diversity in contemporary groups. So this idea of go back and fetch it, it really emphasizes the need to learn from the past. And genetic data, if contemporary and now increasingly ancient populations, can provide a means to re-examine the past, to reimagine a history not told from a Eurocentric perspective, but instead another lens to examine how African peoples made substantial impacts on the lands to which they were brought and fill gaps in knowledge that were created by century-long denial of African peoples having a history worth knowing. As illustrated in the map that I have here, you can see that there were geographic and temporal distributions, as well as the general numbers of people taken from Africa to the Americas. These regions extend across West Africa and include Mozambique and Southeast Africa. Scholars generally report that African slaves were captured from about 24 nations. And when I say nations, I'm referring specifically to linguistic groups. An estimated 8 to 9 million Africans, representing a myriad of ethnic groups, were exported from West and Central Africa, north to Europe, and west to the Americas. By the end of the transatlantic slave trade, the Caribbean had taken in nearly 43%, or roughly 3 million, of all Africans sold in the Western Hemisphere. Few slaves were brought either in from Africa or elsewhere in the Americas to Puerto Rico, and the supply of these was erratic and limited. Historical sources suggest that there was a considerable diversity in the geographic origins and ethnicity of African arrivals, with individuals from West and Central Africa predominating. So although the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and settler colonialism has shaped the genetic histories of Caribbean broadly, the complex patterns of migration from Europe, differences in the number and origins of enslaved African peoples, and the differential survival of indigenous people have shaped broad patterns of variation within the Caribbean. Despite historical records documenting the colonization of Puerto Rico and the import of enslaved African peoples under Spanish rule beginning in the late 16th century, there's still much that's unknown about the origins and the experiences of enslaved Africans within the island and their contemporary contributions to contemporary populations. So to date, there have been a variety of studies, population genetic studies, of contemporary Puerto Rican populations that have been informative about the genetic contributions of indigenous, Caribbean, African, and European peoples to the general populace of the island. These studies really illustrate how admixture between the aforementioned populations were responsive to historical, social, and political factors beginning in the colonial period. Many of the studies pictured here sample a cross-section of the general populace based on census data. However, sociologists, among other scholars, have shown that census counts can sometimes systematically fall short of accurately representing those who really inhabit a region. Historically, these shortcomings have manifested in different ways, but in the case of several Caribbean islands, this includes those who wouldn't be counted in the census, either due to their inability or just unwillingness to count people. And this would have been done to achieve a particular agenda. For example, by discounting the number of native people on a land, it's a little bit easier to annex their land by saying, quote unquote, nobody's there. Alternatively, people are sometimes unwilling to be counted. Okay, so they want to avoid being displaced or otherwise discriminated against. So while census-based studies provide some idea of the people within the island, it's quite possible that they miss populations that have been minoritized and otherwise marginalized. So to this end, I sought to really address the dearth of research on Afro-Puerto Rican communities. In collaboration with a cultural anthropologist and a sociologist, we initiated a community-based project where we aim to examine both Afro-Puerto Rican genetic ancestry and cultural identity. So there's three main goals to this project. The first one really is to identify the genetic origins of Afro-Puerto Ricans. As I just mentioned, we know some evidence, there's some evidence, we know some background as to the likely regions that people came from within Africa, as well as the movement within the Caribbean. But there's still a lot to be learned in terms of the true variation and diversity within African origins of Afro-Puerto Ricans. The second goal of this project is really to examine how Afro-Puerto Ricans understand biological and cultural dimensions of their past. So this is going to be a lot of the ethnographic work that we've been doing and intend to continue once the pandemic passes. The third thing we want to do, and this is really where the community engagement comes in, is that we want to facilitate local artistic interpretations of genetic ancestry and community history. So the group that we're working with it's a community center, but many of these individuals that belong to this community center are artisans. So they are musicians, they are dancers, they are painters. So the idea is that they'll participate in the study, they'll get their ancestry results, and then we're going to ask them to interpret it in their own medium. And the eventual goal is to create a permanent exhibit in this community center that highlights both the genetic ancestry, present some of the science, and then see how the community responds to that in the forms of these different artistic interpretations. So in terms of the population genetics, so the genetic anthropological perspectives of this study, we're really going to focus on the genetic ancestry of self-identified Puerto Ricans with specific attention to African origins, as well as some other regions of ancestry. Right? So we're kind of interested in looking both at the local and regional sources of variation. The larger goal of the project really is to comment on the experiences of African descendants on the island and to examine the intertwining of biology and culture in this specific context. Aside from some of the logistics of doing this study, one of the scholarly challenges I faced was how to appropriately define the study population. And this was a question that I've thought a lot about given my background experience in working in the Anglophone Caribbean, where across the islands, what I've seen is what is really the best approach to thinking about this idea of Blackness. How does that work in Puerto Rico? How is it different than in the United States and some of the other Caribbean islands? Prior to going to the field, I was aware that of the politics of identity in Puerto Rico, especially those identifying specifically as Afro-Puerto Ricans, that it was at times very contentious. And this tension, it really stems from that in Puerto Rico, there's a national narrative about the tricultural heritage in which Puerto Ricans claim ancestry from African, Indigenous American, and Spanish peoples. This assertion of a tricultural heritage includes the inability to claim any one ancestry over the other. So while people may claim to have ancestry from Africa, from Europe, from the Americas, for some Puerto Ricans to emphasize any particular ancestry becomes a very political statement. Okay? And you can see this illustrated in these images here, but that's especially highlighted in this image in the middle, where they emphasize that there were a mix of three, not one, but all. So the complexities of this national narrative, that is narratives about race and self-identification, are not actually new, but instead are embedded in the public consciousness, as is evidenced by references to this issue in blogs. We see it in news stories, in music, and other forms of expression. So pictured here on the screen is a screenshot from a blog from a person whose grandmother participated in a genetic ancestry study done in Puerto Rico in the early 2000s. So this is actually a study that I showed a screenshot of a few slides ago. One of the studies where Dr. Martinez Cruzado was kind of pioneering this work in the early 2000s. So in this blog piece, the blogger Francis recounts how the results of the ancestry test resulted in surprising, as in displeased, reactions from the family when the test results showed African maternal ancestry. Okay, and that's pictured right here, haplogroup L2. This is a mitochondrial genetic family or haplogroup that is commonly found in sub-Saharan Africa. So the finding of the test is documented in the certificate And it's from the study organizers thanking the participant for participating in the study and indicating that their haplogroup is L2. Here is also a piece that was on NPR in 2018. And this is where host Maria Enosa speaks with 4 Afro-Latinos in New York about their experiences of being both Black and Latino in the US. The interviewees describe what it means to them to come to terms with their Blackness in a variety of contexts, including their families, in their childhood, and in their adult lives. One quote is from an interviewee, 𝗷𝗷𝗫𝗍𝗍, and it highlights the heterogeneity of what Blackness means to her. So I'm going to play a quick clip from this interview.
I am not a Black woman in the world. That is not my narrative. I don't share the same narrative as my African-American sister, who is aesthetically and visibly darker than I am. We don't have the same narrative. Our Blackness is not the same, but I am Black.
Okay, so you got a little clip. And again, I'm trying to get at the complexity of what Blackness means. And again, this all relates to the study in terms of thinking about the study population. So I want to ask you to consider that quote and also this now classic poem by a man named Fortunato Vizcarrondo. And I want you to think about this in an effort to understand more about the context of populations, specifically African descendant populations, and then to see how necessary it is to critically think about and engage with how self-identification can influence genetic studies. So the poem I have listed here was published in 1942, and it's titled "¿Y abuela, dónde está?" And where's your grandmother? So the poem I'll play for you is recited by an orator, Eduardo Cortés, and the English translation is presented by Roberto Marquez. The English translation isn't actually word for word, but instead it takes some liberties with language in order to convey and preserve the meaning and the tone of the original poem. So let me play this for you.
Ayer me dijiste negro. Hoy te voy a contestar. Mi mai se sienta en la sala. Pero ¿y tu abuela? ¿A dónde está? Yo tengo el pelo caído. El tuyo es nada más. Tu pai lo tiene bien lacio. Pero ¿y tu abuela? ¿Ah? ¿A dónde está? Tu color te salió blanco y las mejillas rosadas. Los labios tú los tienes finos. Pero ¿y tu abuela? ¿A dónde está? Dice que mi bemba es grande y mi panza colorada. Pero dime por la Virgen. ¿Y tu abuela? ¿A dónde está? Como tu nena es blanquita, la sacas mucho a pasear. Y yo con ganas de gritarte, ¿y tu abuela? ¿A dónde está? A ti te gusta el fotrón. A mí, nunca manigua. Tú te las tiras de blanco. Pero ¿y tu abuela? ¿A dónde está? Eres blanquito, enchapado, que entra en sociedad, teniendo que se conozca la mamá de tu mamá. A quien que no tiene vinga, tiene mandinga. Por eso yo te pregunto, ¿y tu abuela? ¿A dónde está? Ayer me dijiste negra, queriéndome abochornar. Mi abuela sale a la sala y la tuya oculta está. La pobre se está muriendo. A veces está maltratada que hasta tu perro le ladra si acaso a la sala va. Y yo bien que la conozco, se llama Ciñatata. Tú la escondes en la cocina porque es prieta de verdad.
So my point in sharing the blog, the interview clip, and now this poem is that given the political, social, and economic history of African descendants in Puerto Rico and the Americas more broadly, I want to emphasize that the ways in which people self-identify are varied and it's complex, and that it's this complexity that manifests in population-based studies of the island. In particular, in the way in which populations are defined, then sampled, and then the conclusions that one might draw from the data. So despite this national narrative and the complexities of self-identification, I've encountered a contingent within the island that do strongly identify with their African heritage. That is, it's evident in my fieldwork, in online forums, in community groups, in academic circles, in addition to scholars that have studied various aspects of what Blackness means within a Puerto Rican context. Pictured here are several books written by anthropologists and sociologists that highlight the complexity of race and racism in Puerto Rico. In addition, I've included a snapshot of an article published earlier this year in the New York Times about questions of self-identification, race, and the US Census for Puerto Ricans. Okay, so I suppose this was published towards the end of last year. But here you can see this article specifically questioning this idea of race and self-identification, and this kind of public service message as well here, which is saying, don't let them erase you from the census. And again, trying to encourage people to claim their African ancestry if that's indeed what they feel. So when the initial research into Puerto Rican genetic ancestry was completed, and those are some of the studies that I showed you a screenshot earlier, starting in the early 2000s, the results actually quickly entered the popular imagination. In part, the results confirmed the island's tricultural heritage from Spain, Indigenous America, and Africa. The most cited aspect of these results or these studies was actually the high percentage of maternal indigenous ancestry. So despite the previous work, while conducting preliminary fieldwork in March 2017, community members in the Piñones section of Loíza expressed their dissatisfaction with the manner in which the results of the initial genetic tests were presented and then received by Puerto Ricans. Moreover, in response to the media reaction, they felt excluded from the island-wide genetic picture that tended to emphasize indigenous ancestry to the exclusion of other, namely African ancestry. The sentiments of the community members in Piñones are consistent with what other scholars working on Blackness in Puerto Rico have also observed with regards to nationalist recognitions of African heritage, while simultaneously marginalizing Black Puerto Ricans within social and political spheres. It was from this issue our community partnership was forged to explore African ancestry in Afro-Puerto Ricans. So for sampling, we actually employed several qualitative and ethnographic methodologies in order to obtain a more critical and attentive approach to population as it exists and as it's experienced among Afro-descendants in Puerto Rico. Specifically, the study itself was community-based. From the outset, local community members were incorporated and intellectually invested into the study. We also spent a lot of time, a total of 5 months over the course of 2.5 years in the community being participant observers. In addition, my collaborators conducted both structured and unstructured interviews in which they collected information on genealogies, on family and community histories, on racial classifications, the understanding of genetic ancestry. We also asked about folk notions of ancestors, and then we also considered the spatial distribution of Afro-Puerto Ricans, both past and present, and have had our participants really reflect on how all Puerto Ricans understand their ancestry. For the genetic aspects of the study, you can see kind of the criteria that we started with. And again, all of this was modified as we learned more from the participants in the study. So using the ethnographic data, we learned more about the movements and the survival of Afro-descendants on the island. So the stars indicate communities that are identified and are defined by their Blackness, and the arrows illustrate stories of migration throughout time into and throughout Puerto Rico. This information was then used to help refine how participants were identified and then recruited into the study. So pictured here are where the regions where we sampled in spring 2017. Okay? And the following analyses, the results of these analyses are going to be based primarily on this data. I've since been able to collect an additional 28 studies from these locales. So this research has stopped and started a number of times. In 2017, as you all are probably aware, Hurricane Maria devastated the island. And we had some difficulties in locating participants that had begun the study with us, and then recruiting, again, didn't really seem feasible because people were more worried with sort of the everyday logistics of life, finding food, water, and shelter, and repairing their life. So we kind of held off on restarting the study. We restarted it, got some more samples, and now the pandemic hit. So we're currently kind of in this holding pattern, but the community does remain really interested in continuing with this project. On this screen, I just want to show you the distribution of participants' hometowns. So you can see that this is kind of across the island. And what's kind of interesting about this is if you were to consider some of the earlier papers that I showed you, it would look very, very different. In many of those early papers that are based on census data, they really tend to focus on this region of the island, okay, as being a concentration of where Afro-Puerto Ricans are. But again, through the ethnographic perspectives and in the interviews and talking to people, we know not only historically, but just there are these oral histories of different African descendant communities all throughout this region of the island. So as a very quick reminder, I won't spend too much time on this. When we do these sort of genetic ancestry tests, there's two general types of testing that we can do. We can use uniparental markers. So these are genetic markers that are inherited through one parent. And these would be based on mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA. Okay, so with these uniparental markers that I've illustrated here would be ancestry through the matrilines or the patrilines. So the mitochondrial DNA is represented here by the circle, and you can see that these two siblings have the same mitochondrial DNA as their mother, same colors, you know, to illustrate that it's inherited generally unchanged. And this one came from her mother. The cognate for that on the paternal side is the Y chromosome, which is also inherited from father to son, and again, generally unchanged. For the purposes of phylogeny and sort of looking at genetic ancestry, we can organize both mitochondrial DNA and some of these Y chromosome haplotypes into these genetic families that we call haplogroups, okay? And like any family, you might have siblings who look kind of similar. These siblings, we would kind of, the equivalent of that would be a haplotype, and then we group them into these families, okay, known as haplogroups. And these haplogroups, both mitochondrial and Y chromosome, have a kind of this really interesting global distribution, where you'll see some genetic families or these haplogroups at really high frequencies in some parts of the world and virtually absent in other parts of the world. So when we look at this for the purposes of talking about ancestry, you can have your mitochondrial or Y chromosome haplogroup identified, and it can provide some indication as to where your ancestry is. Okay, so within the context of the Caribbean, if somebody tests and has or belongs to mitochondrial haplogroup A, okay, given some of the other information we know about them, we would say, oh, your ancestry is likely from the Americas. Okay, so you see that kind of depicted in this magenta color here. The other broad type of genetic testing that we use in these ancestry tests are autosomal ancestry tests. So autosomal DNA would be the DNA that you've inherited from both your mother and your father. So this gives you a more generalized picture of an individual's ancestry. Now this schematic is really simplified, but it is trying to illustrate this idea of recombination, or the shuffling of genes every generation. Okay, and that's depicted here by the mosaics. So you see that this individual has inherited a mix of his mother's DNA, which has been shuffled, and you see that represented right here with the mosaic of the chromosomes. And the general point of this is that when we look at these autosomes, we're getting kind of a sampling across the genome. Okay, there's a lot more caveats to that, but that's kind of the basic idea. So we'll look at these uniparental markers to learn about the maternal line, the paternal line, and then the autosomal markers to learn more about the sort of generalized ancestry of these test takers. So there are a variety of both limitations and caveats about ancestry testing. So uniparental tests are actually only informative about one family lineage, okay? So here I've kind of X'd out everyone who wouldn't be seen or would be invisible to a test looking at mitochondrial DNA. Okay, and the same thing with the Y chromosome. Everybody that's X'd out, again, is sort of invisible to these sorts of tests. So these uniparental tests can be pretty limited in scope, but irregardless, can be informative about ancestry, both for the individual and then for the aggregate for a population. Another really important point is that ancestry tests are only as good as the reference populations. If reference populations are incorrectly identified or poorly defined, you'll get results, but those results will be no good. They won't be accurate at all. Another kind of interesting caveat to all of this is also kind of rest on this concept known as pedigree collapse. So we all have two biological parents who each had two parents, that's your 4 grandparents, and your grandparents had parents. So now we're at 8 great-great-grandparents. If we go back 40 generations, in theory, we'd have over 2 trillion ancestors. So that's 2 to the power of 40. However, the human population is currently as large as it's ever been. Okay, so in reality, we actually have many fewer ancestors than 2 to the power of 40. And this is because we have ancestors who are the same on both sides of our family. Okay, and this can occur as a result of cousin marriages. And again, this is known as pedigree collapse. Lastly, and this is something I've struggled a lot with, I think it's really important to consider how ancestry estimates are reported. The depiction of ancestry estimates can be very problematic in disentangling false ideas about biology and race. And this is an issue that continuously arises in the marketing of ancestry tests when companies report back a percentage of an ethnic group, okay? Or people will interpret it as having some percentage or proportion of a particular ethnicity. So I've been toying around with different ideas as to how to depict ancestry, but not have my participants so fixated on a particular percentage. So for the first 30 samples taken from the areas I showed you in the map a few slides ago, genotyping was actually done using National Geographic's GenoChip. Okay, so this was part, or kind of at the tail end of the Genographic project. And the last array that was used as part of that project contained 750,000 genome-wide genetic markers that were specifically designed to estimate genetic ancestry. So as I mentioned, the project is over. It ended in 2019. And the original idea of the project was to use DNA to trace the dispersal of humans across the globe. So here's the basic outline of the methodology that we used for the genetic portion of the study. So I collected either buccal swabs or saliva collections. I did in my lab, we did the DNA extractions, and then we submitted them to National Geographic, and then they did the genotyping. They outsourced the genotyping actually using the GenoChip 2.0, which is an Illumina array. And then I was able to download the raw data and then do our own series of analyses. So we looked at uniparental markers, we looked at admixture, we used PCA, so principal component analysis, and then ancestry specific principal component analysis. Another really nice aspect of this project, or sort of this particular methodology, is that National Geographic also had an interface for participants. So those who participated in the study could go and, using their unique ID, could interact with their own data and see what their ancestry was. So thinking about the data analysis, when we received the genotyping, the raw data from the 750,000 SNPs for the 30 people, we had to implement a variety of quality control measures. And that's what I have depicted here. So there are actually many of them, and these are just sort of a simplification. But for our genotyping threshold, we set that at 98%. That resulted in a small reduction of the number of SNPs included in the analysis. So we were down to 711,000 markers. And then we checked for missingness, failed calls, inconsistent sex, duplicate variants, indel variants. There's a variety of other things that we checked for, including like cryptic relatedness. So what we ended up for our final data set in the end was 676,000 SNPs in all 30 people. So we didn't have to drop individuals. So the first set of results that I want to share with you all are coming from these uniparental markers. So we're going to focus on the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. So here, these are those mitochondrial, or those genetic families, the mitochondrial haplogroups that I had mentioned. And again, this is really informative only about the maternal ancestry. And based on these pie charts, what you can see is that the majority of people, 66%, belong to macrohaplogroup L. Okay, so this is indicative of African ancestry. In the inset, you can see the different types of L-type haplogroups. So you see that there's some variability of the different L haplogroups. In addition, you can see that Indigenous American mitochondrial haplogroups, so these are haplogroups A, B, C, and D, make up 29% of the sample. Okay. Finally, there were several people that belong to haplogroup U. Haplogroup 𝗏5b1 tends to be found in Northwest Africa. We also see it in Western and Central Northeast Europe, Central Asia, and a little bit in Siberia. Okay. There are other U5 haplogroups that we observed in our group coming from areas where Berbers are found, as well as the Fulbe in Senegal. And then U5b2 was also found in parts of Eurasia. Right? So again, what we're seeing across this mitochondrial or the maternal lineages is ancestry coming from Africa, from different parts of Europe, which kind of makes sense in the context of the Iberian Peninsula, and then Indigenous America. So here's a look at the distribution of some of these different mitochondrial haplogroups relative to other Caribbean populations. And the Afro-Puerto Ricans, so my sample, okay, is here on the end, and these are other comparative groups taken from the literature. And what you can see is that Afro-Puerto Ricans have more African ancestry than general populace Puerto Ricans, as reported in previous studies. You can also see that there's differences in the distribution of different mitochondrial haplogroups, where in Jamaica and Haiti, okay, there was virtually no indigenous ancestry present. Okay. In subsequent studies that I've done, or actually previous study that I did in Jamaica, I think there actually are pockets in Jamaica where you will find higher amounts of indigenous ancestry. But based on these samples that were part of these previous studies, again, we don't really see it. And again, this sort of reiterates my point that we have to think very carefully about our study population and who you're asking to participate in these studies. So beyond sort of just looking at this distribution, I also ran a Freeman-Houghton extension of the Fisher exact probability test to see if there were any significant differences in the proportion of continental biogeographic origins, as depicted by mitochondrial DNA, between Afro-Puerto Ricans and then each comparative group. And when I did this, I saw that there were statistically significant differences in the proportions of continental ancestry between Afro-Puerto Ricans, and actually there were no statistically significant differences when I compared Afro-Puerto Ricans to Dominicans. Okay? So all the other groups, we sort of see the statistically significant difference in the distribution of these haplogroups, with the exception of the Dominican Republic. And again, this is kind of an interesting idea given the similarity in histories between the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. Looking to the Y chromosome, and this is actually still somewhat of a work in progress. I have one of my grad students looking at some of the newer samples that we've acquired. You can see that the majority of individuals, about 64%, belong to haplogroup E1B1A1. And this haplogroup is actually associated with West African continental ancestry. A second group, about 12%, belong to Y chromosome group R1B1A1. And this haplogroup tends to be most prevalent in individuals with Western European ancestry. And then finally, we found a number of several individuals that belong to haplogroups that are distributed in Europe. So haplogroup I, G, and J, and they can be found both in Europe as well as North Africa. Again, this Iberian kind of connection makes sense. Finally, there was one individual that we found that belonged to Y haplogroup QM3. So this haplogroup is most prevalent in individuals with Native American ancestry. Finding the Q haplogroup is actually pretty rare in the Caribbean, and it hasn't been reported in general populous Puerto Ricans at all. And you saw the sample sizes on some of those previous populations. And where it has been seen in other Caribbean regions, it's reported in less than 7% of the population. And that's coming from a recent study of Dominicans. If we now consider the autosomal ancestry, so these are analyses here. This is actually a subset of everything that I've collected. It's really just based on the first 30 samples that I've collected and were submitted or analyzed using the genochip. We can look at sort of these general patterns of ancestry. The reference groups used in these analyses are shown from our 1,000 genomes reference groups. So when we set our K to 5, you can see that Afro-Puerto Ricans, so down here, clearly have this three-way ancestry pattern, okay? But they also have a lot more African ancestry relative to the 1,000 genomes Puerto Rican population, okay? So here you should be thinking or sort of matching the colors up. Matching the colors up. So Yorubans are groups from, is a group from Nigeria, from Africa. So this purple is to show kind of this African ancestry. And you can sort of see the different color blocks with the other sort of reference groups. On the bottom of this screen, I also have the ancestral proportions for Afro-Puerto Ricans. These are the 1,000 genome Puerto Ricans, and then this is the 1,000 genomes reference group from Barbados. Okay, and what you can see here, this is South Asian and East Asian. These groups don't have that much genetic contributions to present day Caribbean groups, at least not these Caribbean groups. And the ancestry, goodness, is primarily coming from African populations, the Americas, and Europe. And again, I'll just draw your attention to the differences that we see between Afro-Puerto Ricans and these general populous Puerto Ricans. And again, reiterating the point that sampling really does matter in terms of how we might characterize or think about variation as it exists in contemporary populations. So if we look at the principal components analysis, so here you're looking at PC1 versus 2, you'll see that there's a geographic distribution overall in this PCA. Okay? And what you'll see is that the Afro-Puerto Ricans, and these are represented by circles, cluster between Puerto Ricans. So these would be represented by those depicted by triangles, okay? And those from Barbados, okay, represented by the plus sign. So we see our Afro-Puerto Ricans kind of nested in between Puerto Ricans, general populous Puerto Ricans, and then those from Barbados. And then all of this is in this clinal pattern, which itself is nestled between European populations you see in purple and African reference populations in red. In this PCA, which is component 1 versus 3, you can see more of a regional distribution. Here you have basically the Americas up here, okay, and then down in this part of the PCA would be Africa, Asia, and Europe. Okay, so what we're seeing is these broad regional clustering. So along PC1, you see Africans versus non-Africans, and along PC3, you see Africans, European, Asians versus the Americas. So all of the Puerto Ricans tend to fall closer to the African, European, Asian portion of the PCA, and then are dispersed between African and European clusters. While the 1,000 genomes Puerto Ricans tend to be closer to the European cluster, and the 1,000 genomes Bajans or Barbadian population, they tend to be closer to the African populations. We see that the Afro-Puerto Ricans, again, are clustered right in the middle. So these PCAs really support this national narrative of a trihybrid ancestry. However, they also illustrate that African and European ancestry are not necessarily homogeneous within the island, that there are ancestries that actually vary a lot within and between Puerto Ricans. And we know this because of the sort of spread of these circles throughout the plot. We can also see that Afro-Puerto Ricans, they have this sort of wider range of ancestry within this group. There are some individuals who have very little African ancestry and others who have pretty much only African ancestry. So as I interpret this pattern is really instructive about how ancestry and social identities might function in Puerto Rico. In this case, it seems to be somewhat similar to African Americans in the US. In that this result really is this social legacy of the rule of hypodescent, or this one-drop rule. Okay, so the one-drop rule states that people who are to identify with the ancestry of the lower class. Now, I make this point not to say that the one-drop rule exists or is even the same in Puerto Rico. In fact, a number of sociologists, a number of anthropologists have detailed that race actually functions somewhat differently in Puerto Rico relative to the US. What I see this is really being inclusive of different racial categories and the social knowledge about how different phenotypes register as belonging to one racial category versus another. These differences in how race is understood is actually highlighted among the clips that I showed you, the poem that I shared with you. And I want to share or sort of have this discussion about genetic ancestry and self-identified race. Not because I want to profess that there's any sort of direct relationship between race and genetics. I'm not professing that, and I do not think that there is a direct relationship. But I think that it's really instructive for thinking about how patterns of genetic variation change in relation to social and experiential constructs of identity, inclusive of race. And all of this can really help us to understand how biology and culture are intertwined. So I have one more PCA I want to share with you, and this is the Ancestry Specific PCA. Okay, so in this PCA, we're basically sort of hiding the ancestral elements that we're not particularly interested in for this analysis, and then focusing on the specific ancestry. So in this case, this would be the African ancestry. Okay, so what you can see here is that the Afro-Puerto Ricans tend to cluster with those in green, so that would be the Upper Guinea reference groups in orange, the Lower Guinea, and to a lesser extent, our kind of pink comparative group, which is coming from West Central Africa. And this is actually somewhat of a different pattern from the comparative population from Barbados. They tend to only cluster with the comparative group from Lower Guinea, so in the orange. So for me, as I interpret this analysis, it's really suggestive that there were different iterations of African influx into the Caribbean, and consequently, there may be some unrecognized heterogeneity of African descendants throughout the Americas. Furthermore, we can see that Afro-Puerto Ricans have a wider distribution in this plot relative to those from the reference groups from Barbados. So while additional research is needed to identify why we see this particular pattern, it's really suggestive that either sampling of the 1,000 genome reference group from Barbados is either limited, maybe not representative of the island, or that Puerto Rico and Barbados had really different histories with regard to the slave trade and inter-island migration, which has now impacted Africans and African descendants who ended up in each respective island. From a broader perspective, what this plot really suggests is that though there are many similarities with regard to the general impact of the transatlantic slave trade on the Caribbean, there are differences in ancestral origins and by extension, differences in cultural influences that would have shaped each respective population. So in other words, African ancestry is not the same across populations within the African diaspora. What this means or how this translates to understanding more about each different population remains to be seen. Moreover, this could be an important point if it has meaningful implications in other fields like epidemiology, where there are already some studies that suggest differences in health outcomes between Afro-Latinos and African Americans. So I've actually come across a variety of studies that look at health outcomes, particularly for women's health. And they do note that there are some differences between individuals who self-identify as Afro-Latino, born outside of the US, versus African Americans. So this is a point of interest, something that I intend to revisit. So in the near future, I want to continue working on this project. Obviously, I want to finish it when this pandemic draws to an end. But I really want to continue focusing on the nature of genetic ancestry in Loíza and Piñones and other regions of Black communities in Puerto Rico. We also hope to learn more about what genetic data might actually reveal about Indigenous and African interactions in Puerto Rico and more broadly in the Caribbean. Ultimately, we hope to understand more about how participants talk about their ancestors and how they make sense of the genetic ancestry results. We also hope to offer a different perspective, one that is purposefully inclusive of those who've been overlooked on the histories and peoples of Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. So I want to end this talk where I began. Okay? So just as the protagonist in 𝗔Ｈ𝘁𝗵𝗿𝐺𝗀𝗆𝐺 poem makes the point that African heritage is an important part of Puerto Rican national identity, despite efforts to hide it or devalue it, our work kind of aligns with the ethos of this poem. Along with our community partners, we seek to use our science, the genetics and the anthropology, to really illuminate that which has been obscured and then to celebrate that diversity. And with that, I'll end there. So as always, I'd like to thank my study participants, my community partner, Maricruz Rivera-Clemente, as well as my fieldwork assistants for supporting my efforts. I'm also indebted to the work that's been done by my stellar graduate students, Taye Winful, Katie McCormick, and my lab staff. I also acknowledge my collaborators, Dr. Gabriel Torres Colon and Dr. Maria Nieves Colon, as they both provided some invaluable help and insights on every level of this project. And then finally, I always like to thank those who pay the bills. So thank you to the College of Arts and Science and the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at Vanderbilt for seed funding. I also am grateful to National Geographic, who will be funding the next iteration or part of this project. Okay? So with that, I'll stop and I'm happy to take questions.
That was fabulous. Thank you so much, Jada. It was really fascinating and a really beautiful presentation. If anybody has any questions, just please turn on your camera and feel free to ask your question. Luis, do you have a question? You're muted.
Louise, you're muted.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, I'm here. I had a hard time following genetics. My genetics is very tiny in terms of what I know. So, but look, it's fascinating because I thought the stuff I really got was this business about the group that you sampled had so much more clearly Afro genetics than the wider population, and how that kind of disappears in these studies based on census groups. I think that's a really important thing. And but the other thing I think that is really terrific about your study is it's so collaborative, that you are working with communities, and that you know, you're going to have this big exhibit in the cultural center when you're finished. I think that's a totally important part of this.
Thank you.
That's my comments. I got no questions.
Thank you. It's good to see you, Louise. Yeah, that's actually something I'm trying to push for in our field. These sorts of community work, it takes time. And you know, as a geneticist, we're not always given that kind of time it takes to embed yourself and stay with the community for a little while. Right. It's usually get your samples and get back to the lab and then get to the computer. But I'm trying to kind of change the field so that we have the time to kind of do these more in-depth studies. And again, they should be collaborative.
No, and I think one of the things is that you've got so many students working with you. Maybe there'll be a whole new generation of collaborative genetic anthropologists out there.
I'm trying.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just say that I found that to be really fascinating too. This question of you know, identifying your sample or just characterizing your sample. Who are these people? You know, is actually a really important question that I don't think biological anthropologists pay nearly enough attention to oftentimes. You know, you can get some health data from some group wherever, and it's like, yeah, but who are these people? You know, how do they live? But this question is a really, really important one. And yeah, so that was really fascinating. I have a couple other questions, but Ozzy, do you have something?
Yeah, I actually had a quick comment and then a question. The comment is that I was doing some reading recently, and actually in Brazil, there's a national kind of narrative of a three-way mix as well. Almost like a refusal to consider anything else, but that's often not the lived experiences of people on the ground. And I guess the question then is, to what extent, or can you comment on what sort of factors have kept the Puerto Rican population from just totally homogenizing?
Politics, economics. That's probably a much bigger question than I'm properly trained to answer. But I think that it gets complicated specifically because of the relationship that Puerto Rico has with the United States. As realistically, it's a modern day colony. And there are particular reasons why they might want to be identified in certain ways to maintain that relationship or potentially become a state. You bring up a really interesting point with Brazil. There's a social cultural anthropologist by the name of Sarah Abel, and she's done some field work specifically about genetic ancestry in, I think she did some work in Martinique, as well as in Brazil, and I actually talk about it in the book a little bit. But Brazil's a really interesting place to think about these issues of the intersections between race, identity, and genetics. There are some activists there who were featured, for example, in one of these shows that highlighted their ancestry. And it ended up backfiring on them because their ancestry showed that they had European ancestry. So they were at once conflicted with, how do I, acknowledge that, yes, I have European ancestry, I have African ancestry, and that, there's still this thing of oppression. What do we do? What do we do with this? So it's very complicated when we start to think about these things in a historical context, as well as the lived experience, like what this actually means to people and how it functions in their society.
Well, I'll go ahead and ask one of my other questions. So one thing that I've wondered about, and I know that you've you've written a book about this, but I'm curious about, like, when people are interested, and I guess I'm talking about people in general, because I'm not somebody who's ever been really motivated to take a DNA test. It's not something that has really been something that I care too much about, but I am actually curious about the level of specificity that people who do take these tests are interested in their genetic ancestry. What kind of level of specificity they care about. I'm sure there's some variation in this, but is it really just a matter of, do I have African ancestry, or do they want to know more about, like, does the location in Africa, is that meaningful or something like that? Do you know what I mean? Like, just how much information are people really looking for in these types of these tests?
Well, I will start answering your question by saying that many of these are direct to consumer tests. They oversell what they can actually tell people. And I understand that it's a business. I understand what they're trying to do. At the same time, there are people who really do want answers. I had the good fortune of joining in on a focus group. This was a group of African Americans who had taken ancestry tests 2 years ago and then periodically meet to talk about their ancestry tests and what they've learned with their genealogy. And they invited me into one of their sessions, and I got to present some of my work. And then I got to listen. And I learned about, what they wanted, why they took their motivations for taking these sort of ancestry tests, the results they were looking for. And I think, yes, a lot of them really were looking for specific areas. They were ready to take their ancestry test, get the results, and then buy a plane ticket because they were going to this place in Africa. So there was a lot of frustration when they found out, okay, it's a little more regionally, the results are a little more regionally depicted. And so there was some disappointment in that. There was also a little bit of tension, frustration with, there are certain companies which will kind of try and tell you what your ethnic group is. And again, yeah, they're kind of overselling it, particularly when you're looking at these low resolution markers like mitochondrial or Y, and they're ubiquitous in this region. So you can't necessarily say, oh yes, for sure, that's Mende versus Fulbe. But that is the specificity that people want. And, genetics doesn't really offer that. That being said, it has offered some people, I don't know if I would call it, I guess it gives them something to think about. It's something they have to resolve in themselves, specifically when they see they have ancestry that is beyond just Africa. There are, groups of African Americans, and I've kind of read about this in other people's work and in the Caribbean as well, that aren't necessarily interested in learning about the ancestry, deep ancestry. They don't need to know where in Africa they came from. They're actually more interested as to what happened once they were in the Caribbean or in the Americas, and how that mixing or the sort of coming together of populations occurred. So there's different motivations for people that do this. And it's something that I'm continuously interested in, and when I get these opportunities to talk to folks, I definitely listen.
Thank you. Yeah, super interesting talk. Are there any other questions? Heather, were you going to ask a question? Oh. Hi there.
If I may.
Yes.
Adriana Ramirez from the Women's Studies Department. Thank you, Dr. Benn Torres, for such a great presentation. I wanted to share a couple of comments, not only as a fellow alumni of the Anthropology Department at UNM, but also as somebody born in Puerto Rico, in that Mayagüez town, where Martinez Cruzado originated a bunch of his mitochondrial studies. I appreciate Dr. Osborne Pearson comment, and I wanted to add that coming as a cultural anthropologist into this equation, it's useful, I believe, to separate genetic ancestry vis-a-vis cultural ancestry. And looking at the three main groups, I could not help but think, and here I bring Michael Taussig into the iconography of las tres potencias, the three powers, which is an iconography of the three main racial groups, with several quotation marks on both ends. And personally, for me, I always found interesting how the white element, always cast in the middle, in the seal of the Instituto de Cultura Puertorriqueña, it's perverse. It's actually one of the motivations that led me into my own project. The middle one is, of course, the Spaniard one, but he's a colonizador fully dressed in conquistador metal gear, holding the grammar of the Spanish language, whereas the African and Indian components to each side, smaller, partially dressed, are carrying ceramics or a machete, as opposed to the tres potencias in African indigenous syncretism, where the middle person is still white, but it's a woman. Kind of a decolonial feminist statement right there. It's also interesting to me to think of these mitochondrial DNA findings, particularly with Martinez Cruzado's work on the Guanche population coming Berbers from the Canarias, and Taíno, where he finds these significant concentrations in the West Coast, where I'm from. And then he proceeds to say, but geez, how interesting that it's mainly through the woman's line that we find these genes. And for me, and here's my 3 squares away, I see Louise Lamphere, my dear mentor, chair of my committee. I just keep thinking, well, that's called colonial rape. You bet. You're gonna find more of the enslaved whether encomiendas with the native Taínos or slavehood proper, well, of course you're gonna find a bigger concentration in the mitochondrial genes, because what are the odds that enslaved men are gonna be having sex, consensual or not, with master's class women, right? I also wanted to alert you again in the cultural angle of it. There's a phrase along the poem of ¿Y tu abuela dónde está? Where's your grandma? When somebody is born into a family slightly darker, people say requinto, re-fifth. You guys are the geneticists. I don't even know what it means, but it's this folkloric understanding of genetics, that you may be looking white, but where's your grandma? And so it's like suddenly the baby born takes us out of the closet, of the racial closet. Requintaste. You unveiled us as having some African blood. Yeah, finally, with the reluctance to either engage or trust census questionnaires, particularly now with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it is not news to me that people in Puerto Rico have died in the testing. The colonial medical history of Puerto Ricans, I would presume, may contribute to the reluctance of engaging, let alone trusting, anything that reeks of medical testing. I'll give a shout out to the foundational text, I think now, by Annette Ramirez Arellano, Colonialism, Catholicism, and Contraception. This later stage of colonialism has featured pharmaceuticals as the imperial power. So for me, it resonated that, of course, people don't trust giving your genes, even your fingerprints, let alone your genetic markers, to American entities, right?
Yeah.
Beautiful work. Thank you.
Thank you. You made up some you've made some really interesting points, and going back to your comment on the iconography. Again, I don't have that much time to go into it, but oftentimes, at least in my experience when I'm in Puerto Rico and looking around, the depictions of Afro-Puerto Ricans really center around food and music. Right, so you're seeing kind of these cultural things, but you don't necessarily see any intellectual or medical advances, or you don't see that. It's really just the artists, music, and food. And I think that is interesting. It's really, really interesting to think about within the context of the Americas. And I'm looking forward to kind of thinking about what do I do with that? What does that actually mean? With the census sampling, those studies I think are still instructive. And I want to give credit to Martinez Cruzado, because when he started this study, it was the early 2000s. So this was all new information. And his method of doing things is very systematic. I just think that we have to interpret those results very carefully, and not necessarily say, this is representative of the island. Just reading the studies and a little bit of the history I've read, I was kind of surprised that they didn't think a little more critically about the results and how they've interpreted the results in terms of, African descendants are only in this 𝗏𝗏ice area where, just a superficial reading of the history would suggest, no, that's not right. There had to be other populations, particularly around the southern coast, where we know about that. Irregardless, again, for being someone that was pioneering this work at the time, I have to give him credit for that. And also, back in 2000, it was a little bit easier to get people to give DNA because there weren't as many things as you could do with it now. You really couldn't get into their business in the ways that you can today. So again, yes, you're right. In the backdrop of specifically like the birth control testing that went on, which is still in the living memory of many women on the island, there is no doubt that there is a hesitancy with medical anything. And then finally, one thing that one of your comments made me think about was when we were talking with participants and we would ask them about, okay, who's your mother, who's your grandmother, where do they come from? Oftentimes the conversation would end up a discussion about phenotypes, right? They're telling me about, the skin color or the lip shape or the lassie or the hair or et cetera. So it was really interesting to think about these folk notions of ancestry and race and how it sort of always goes into what the person looks like. So I think there's a lot more to kind of do with that and to chew on it for a bit. So thank you. I appreciate
your inclusion of history into this otherwise ever so STEM study. It's interesting for me to wonder how the Moorish ancestry of what we call today Spain, bearing in mind that 1492 was not just the year that Columbus acquired, as in mergers and acquisitions, acquired the Americas for the Spanish crown, but that it was also the year in which Queen Isabella and Fernando de Aragon expelled the last Jewish and Arabs, Muslim, from the south of Spain, Caliphate. Mm-hmm. So many of them jumped into the boats coming to the Americas. Therefore, you see this nose popping back in this side of the Atlantic. And then in the 1800s, once the other Latin American colonies had seceded, had become independent, Spain engaged through something that looked like NAFTA, tax exemptions, loans without interest, urging Spaniards, and at this point, you don't even have to be Spaniard, just swear your loyalty to the crown, begging them to move to Puerto Rico and Cuba in an eugenics gesture, lest we are totally blackified. And in Puerto Rico, the population grew 85%. So there's this wave of something that 3 of my great-grandparents were part of, but it was genocidal-ish, however, in terms that it was specifically intended to change the demographics. But there again, all these people with genetic baggage from the north of Africa came in. It's just not sexy and it doesn't fit into the three potencias. So it gets kind of brushed to the side. Yes. And they did not think themselves Spaniards. They thought themselves Catalonians. And they moved to the west and south of the island, since San Juan was Spaniard. The plot gets thicker. I love your research.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
It's beautiful. It's generous. It's
super interesting across various like Caribbean islands, and in like Argentina, for example. That's another ball of wax to start to unravel.
Argentinian accent is Spanish with an Italian accent.
Mm-hmm. But there used to be Afro-Argentines. Where are they now?
Uh-huh.
Thank you. Are there any other questions before we let Jada go? Well, once again, Jada, thank you so much for a truly wonderful talk. It was really just a pleasure to have you back virtually in Albuquerque.
All right. Well, thank you. It was good to see you all.
Thank you so
I
much.
really enjoyed this, seeing familiar faces and sort of thinking about my own academic roots right here.
All right. See
All
you
right, bye.
later, Jada.
Thanks.
Thank you.